Hello and welcome to an overdue video for English literature pre-1760 on satire. This video is just going to be a brief discussion of a couple of the thematic issues that we're dealing with this week in relation to the Dunciad and A Modest Proposal, and drawing a little bit on what Dustin Griffin has written about two aspects of satire that I think are really crucial to understanding how satire works, or getting an insight into why we care about satire and why we, as readers, tend to be drawn towards satire. These are things that you're already thinking about in relation to the discussion forum for this week, and it draws on our readings from last week. So I'll just start by talking a little bit about my thoughts on the pleasures of satire and the politics of satire, and then I'll talk a little bit about A Modest Proposal in terms of the political implications of that text, and what we might, what maybe part of what I think makes it a very influential and very important satire. And finally, then I'm going to spend a little bit of time at the end just talking about the video presentation, which is due next week. And just talking about what I think is the video presentation maybe should look like. Okay, so just in terms of the Dustin Griffin has this chapter on the pleasures of satire, and he's asking this sort of quite fundamental question, but it's one we don't often ask ourselves, which is, well, what is it that as readers we gain from reading satire? What is it that attracts us to satire? And he posits a few possibilities. One is that it may give us a feeling of triumph, or a feeling of moral or intellectual superiority. And his example for this is actually the Dunciad, and I think that there's a good reason for that. Is because here's a poem that's about how stupid and dull all of these sort of intellectual figures are. And even though as readers we haven't actually, may not even be familiar with the people we're reading, or if we are, they are probably our intellectual superiors, but as readers we share the perspective of the speaker, and so we get to participate in that sense of moral and intellectual superiority by reading and by sharing that perspective. A related pleasure that he identifies is the ability to define oneself as good in opposition to the failings of other people. That by reading a satire and recognizing the failings, the moral or intellectual failings of somebody else, we are able to define ourselves as being good or morally upstanding. Probably a slight variation on that he also identifies is the idea that we can project our failings onto others. Swift frequently notes the idea that we tend in reading satire to recognize the failings that are being identified in a satire as those of the people around us, and so we're able to project things that maybe are insecurities that we possess at that moment. There's a sort of sense of release because those failings belong somewhere else. They're projected elsewhere, and we never feel that we're necessarily the object of the satire. As readers, we usually regard ourselves as sympathizing with the speaker. He also notes that there's a certain amount of enjoyment in decoding certain types of satire, particularly allegorical satire. I was thinking of this in terms of like Absalom and Achitophel, the Dryden poem that we did earlier in the semester. That this provides us with a sense of being in the know and having a certain amount of intellectual cachet, because we're able to see that he's writing about Absalom and Achitophel, but it's really about the succession of Charles II and the succession crisis that came after that. And that's probably something that we don't necessarily recognize, that we're getting pleasure from that decoding, but it's certainly there. And you certainly see it when people are interpreting something like Animal Farm in more modern times, that the recognition of the parallels sort of conveys a certain pleasure, and it's a pleasure of, again, a sense of moral belonging and a sense of intellectual insight. One sort of effect of this is that satire can often oversimplify or reduce a complex moral problem to a very simple or witty or funny insight, and that gives us a sense of mastery over those complexities, right? And by oversimplifying something and making it terse and witty and to the point, we feel as if we share in that mastery. So there's a kind of these are all variations of the same thing, that satire gives us a sense of belonging to an in-group, first of all, and secondly, it gives us probably unearned sense of our own moral or intellectual brilliance, because we sort of share the disdain that the satirical speaker has for whatever the object of the satire is. There are some alternative ways of thinking about the pleasures of satire, though, and one of them is sadism. The idea that, in fact, when we read satire, we may at times, in fact, be wallowing in our own moral failings, or facing up to our own moral failings, and getting some enjoyment out of the moment of recognition that we are, in fact, the object of this satire, rather than simply trying to avoid being the object of satire, as Swift contended. Related to that is a maybe unpleasant type of or maybe, let's say, an ugly type of masochism, that we take pleasure in other people being ridiculed, seeing other people being humiliated. Griffin even compares it to the reason why public executions were and remain so popular in countries where they still have public execution, is that there is a sort of an ugly side of humanity that gets pleasure out of seeing the humiliation or the debasement of other people. And what's interesting is that satire can also give us pleasure by our thinking ill of human nature. So it's kind of an irony of it that satire itself can be an object of the worst aspects of human nature, our tendency to take pleasure in the suffering of other people. But it can also let us feel like we're getting an insight into how ugly human nature is. And what's interesting is when we take that sort of cynical pleasure in thinking that human nature is bad, that people are fundamentally not good, we in some sense maybe exempt ourselves from it. I've always felt that when people say, well, humans are fundamentally bad, or that we're awful, that there's a kind of contradiction built into saying it, because we require a moral compass or a moral sense of goodness that can only come from humanity as well. There is no, there is no way of judging human behavior as bad unless we're comparing it to other human behaviors. And there's a sense in which taking a cynical pleasure in the badness of human nature can allow us to both exempt ourselves from that sense of human nature, and also it removes the possibility of being disappointed by human behaviors, because we've already sort of embraced the idea of negativity. Related to this question of the pleasures of satire is, well, what are the political effects of satire? And we've already talked earlier in the semester about the idea that satire doesn't necessarily change people's minds or persuade them, right? So the two questions that that Griffin is really asking here are, first of all, what are the political effects of satire if it's not likely to persuade people? And secondly, what are the political conditions that give rise to satire? When does satire tend to emerge? His initial question is whether or not satire is fundamentally subversive or conservative. Does it tend to undermine the social structure or the society in which it's written, or does it seem to work to conserve and preserve current social structures? It seems to me that there isn't a single answer to that. Even within our own course, we can see that somebody like Dryden is very much a spokesperson on behalf of Charles II, and somebody who writes very vehemently against certain, he's taking a side in the Tory Whig successionist debates, and he's very much on the side of the status quo in the era of Charles II. However, when we look at somebody like Swift, his attacks seem very much directed towards the status quo and the way that the powers that be think about, say, the situation in Ireland. And so it's very hard to generalize about whether the intention of satire is subversive or conservative. Is very much dependent on the perspective of the writer. What he does say, though, is that the conditions that give rise to satire are very seldom the ones that we would think of. So he immediately says, well, we often think satire is because of there's an era of particularly egregious corruption or governmental incompetence will give rise to this very cynical literary culture. And he points out that this isn't the case. There's no particular correlation between periods of very good satirical work and periods of high levels of corruption. Corruption is always present in politics to one degree or another. He similarly dismisses the idea that having great access to freedom of speech gives rise to good satire. Points out very, very clearly that if you have a very, what's the word I'm looking for? Very strong, we'll go with strong, very strong freedom of speech laws that protect your right to say what you want. Satire doesn't tend to thrive in those circumstances. He points out, for one thing, that when there are no restrictions on what you can say about government or anything like that, people tend to be much more directly and overtly critical, and they do so without recourse to satire. Satire tends to emerge in circumstances where there are limits on what you can say, and so writers appeal instead to irony and indirection, allegory, and these sort of indirect ways of addressing addressing political issues. So in fact, strong freedom of speech laws are not necessary or even conducive to satire. There needs to be, in fact, something that satire is working against, some sense of censorship or restriction on what you can say, or even fear of what it's okay to say. He also rejects the idea that satire emerges at times when higher forms have been exhausted. This is often an argument that's made that in the aftermath of in a generation after a lot of high epic poetry has been produced, such as in the era of Horace, people don't take epic poetry seriously, and therefore a more sarcastic tone like in satire is likely to emerge. And the same argument is made in the era that we're looking at, that in the aftermath of Spenser and so on, or Milton, that very earnest, serious, epic style of poetry gives way to a more sort of cynical, ironic tone, and he sort of rejects that idea as well for various sort of historical reasons. So he's sort of turning down all of those reasons, and the ones that he posits instead are the presence, first of all, of an access to the classics. So people with a good classical education in Latin and Greek tend to be more likely to write satire, because satire achieved a very high degree of sophistication in the era of Horace, Juvenal, and Lucilius, and so on. He also says there needs to be a taste for ridicule among a small, homogeneous audience, closely based in a capital city or a center of culture, where all the writers know one another, and usually in an era where art is regarded as politically engaged. Okay, so he's sort of saying that these are very specific conditions that give rise to satire, and the one that's most interesting to me there is the idea that art needs to be regarded as politically engaged. In many eras, let's say, for example, in the mid-20th century, there emerged a sense that art should be, in some sense, detached from the world around it, that art is the pursuit of beauty, and that it should not be mired in the ugliness of the everyday or in politics, but rather it should be the investigation of the psychological inward life of humans and so on. That kind of attitude that art is in some sense autonomous from the political world is obviously not particularly conducive to satire. And I think that does explain why satire has become a slightly more, it's not a literary form now, but it is very much present in popular culture, precisely because in literary culture there has been a sort of move away from a politically engaged literature, and that's changing now, I think, for the better, but it's been changing in the 21st century. It also, as he points out, needs to have some resistance, which I've talked about already, the idea that there needs to be some sort of restrictions on freedom of speech. He points out also that satire is in some ways a type of social climbing. It's a way of establishing a name for yourself and hopefully establishing a position within a society and gaining respect. And that implies a certain amount of conservatism to a lot of satire. I would suggest that Swift, who regarded himself as a failure in life, he was sort of marginalised as this dean in Dublin, which was really to be exiled from the heart of British, let's say English culture. To be sent to Ireland was a real step down for anybody, and he definitely wanted to be in the heart of things. And it may be that his failures in life are attributable to just how sharp his satire was, that it was maybe too sharp. Like I say, some writers are obviously defending the status quo, and others are kind of attacking it. But most often, I think you'll probably see this yourself if you're thinking about contemporary satirical work. There's a sense in which people often agree with the current moral order, but with some adjustments. They're not necessarily looking to revolutionize the world around them. My sense is that really radical opponents of the status quo, people who really want to upend the logic of a society and destroy the institutions that currently exist, they don't go in for nod and wink kind of irony. They don't have much of a sense of humor or a sense of like, you know, here's a little bit of a joke. So I don't think it lends itself, that kind of radicalism doesn't lend itself to being funny very often. There are some exceptions. One thing that Griffin points out is that satire, and this comes back to what we were saying before about it not necessarily being about persuasion, but rather that it may serve to give comfort to people who desire change rather than persuade people to agree, right? So people who are currently not politically ascendant or not whose political beliefs are not in fashion or don't hold any sway in the corridors of power, are in some sense comforted, and their morale is kept high by the existence of satire, the possibility of laughing at and feeling morally superior to, and taking that that pleasure we were just talking about at the start of the video. Like taking that pleasure is a sort of comfort when you don't actually have power. And again, to think of contemporary examples, if you think about how many sort of satirical TV shows there are on TV right now that are highly critical of Republicans and highly critical of the Trump administration, that the popularity of shows like John Oliver, The Daily Show, or Hassan Minhaj, and all of these people, that it may be attributable to a sense that left-wing people are largely out of power at the moment, and so they take a kind of comfort in satire, right? So there's a sort of sense in which moral victory can be a temporary substitute for material victory, and it can kind of keep people's spirits up. The other argument that Griffin makes is the idea that satire can serve as a safety valve for political opposition. And his example of that again is Swift, that in offering these like acerbic, biting critiques of state policy and the logic that underlies state policy, that in some ways he serves the state that he critiques, because he gives vent to ideas that might otherwise become really disruptive and really subversive. So these are all possibilities to think about what sort of purpose satire might serve. And you might think about that in terms of when you're responding to the discussion forum. What sort of purpose do you think this serves? For me, though, I do have a problem with the idea that, like, Griffin's general sort of, not pessimism, but let's say he's sort of dismissive of the notion that satire can have any real profound effect on a society, or that it can really profoundly change things. You can take some isolated examples where a satirist has really pursued something and forced change. I know, I can't remember this guy's name, but I know in France, the last few years, a major satirist moved into politics and became very popular and so on. And you can think of those sort of examples a lot. But there are examples where satire is really thriving at a moment just before massive social upheaval and change. Like in pre-Soviet Russia, there was a huge spike in satirical writing, and soon after we get Soviet Russia. Now, it's not that satire led to those changes, but it's also not true to say that satire just gives vent to change, or sort of suppresses demands for change, and it can certainly form part of a sort of discourse of resistance and a discourse of subversion. There are these historical examples of where that's happened. So I still think that there's something to be said for the idea that satire can change the world around it and can persuade people to change their minds. It generally doesn't, but it's more that it's maybe part of a general culture or general atmosphere of either cynicism, conservatism, radicalism. Satire can serve many different purposes, but the point is that it isn't always just speaking to people who already agree with it, or it isn't always just a little bit of comfort. It may actually help to form, refine, and define opinion, right? So there are, I think there are arguments to be made for the active relevance of satirical work. In that context, it's interesting to look at the Modest Proposal to see how he uses contemporary discourses and sort of subverts their logic, or sort of extends their logic, right? So you're all aware of the text at this point, and you know what the proposal is, right? The argument I would make is that he's using this discourse of rationality and logic, this very rigidly logical way of thinking. It's almost unassailable in its logic, and that's the way it's written. Is like, if you disagree with this, then you're disagreeing with facts, right? So here are all the facts. When you're presented with these facts, it is unassailably true that we have to do this. And that kind of relentless rationality and that apparent logic, he's revealing how that can so easily become inhuman and so easily become barbaric, right? It's the pursuit of its relentless logic can very easily blind you to the human consequences of what's being proposed, right? But it operates on two levels, and I think there's one post already on the discussion forum that has kind of already recognized this, but the proposal operates on two sort of rhetorical levels. So the idea itself is barbaric. Killing and eating children obviously is barbaric. But the whole point of the proposal is that it's premised on the idea that the current reality of Ireland is even more barbaric than doing that. So at the same time, you could read this straight and say this is a damning critique of the real policies of English colonialism in Ireland, and say this would be better. Things are so bad for the Irish peasantry that killing and eating the children would be better. But it's also, so it's perfectly sincere, it can be read there, and simultaneously you can read it ironically, right, that killing and eating the children of the Irish peasantry is kind of what English colonialism does now. And it's that sort of political context that I just wanted to briefly address, which is in the previous like 200 years before he writes Modest Proposal, Ireland had increasingly been subjugated as a matter of English colonial policy, mainly through plantation. There were a series of policies enacted where Irish areas were planted with English Protestant settlers in order to remove the Roman Catholic populations and hand the land over, where possible, to these settlers, thereby getting rid of Irish resistance to colonial rule. And this had happened most successfully in Ulster, but it had also been attempted in Offaly and Laois, and it had been attempted in Munster as well. So there were three major plantations. One of them really took. But there was also the era of Oliver Cromwell, and that's the more immediate context for a Modest Proposal is that Oliver Cromwell had arrived in Ireland and had decided that his policy was to banish the native Irish of the west and south of Ireland, or sorry, the east and south of Ireland, to the west. So his famous saying was "To hell or to Connacht." If you were a member of the Irish gentry or the Irish aristocracy, or for that matter the peasantry, you were to be displaced. And while Cromwell is regarded as a kind of Republican hero in English and in even American discourses, in Ireland he's regarded as a villain of history, and very rightly so. He was a brutal invader. And Connacht, the reason they were being sent to Connacht, by the way, is because the land was worse there. So the best land was being taken for settlers, right? What emerged during those couple of hundred years was a very strong landlord class of English settler class who owned huge tracts of land, and the Irish peasantry rented that land from those landlords. The Irish peasantry was also inclined towards very large families, and so because they were Roman Catholic, but also because they were very poor, and this led to massive subdivision of tenement land, of tenant land, and the gradual immiseration and impoverishment of the Irish peasantry. So there had been a very systematic attempt to displace the Irish peasantry and to impoverish the Irish peasantry and exploit it. While that was happening, English people for whom this reality is completely invisible, the problem is not visible to you, you don't really have to care about it, right? And you certainly don't have to acknowledge the complicity of English government in creating that problem. So over time, solving the problem of Irish poverty and Irish overpopulation became, in English eyes, solving the problem of the peasantry themselves. So it's not that you need to face up to the English colonial administration's complicity in creating all of this poverty. The poor people themselves become the problem, right? And so removing these poor people becomes a way of solving the problems of their poverty, right? So there is a fundamental lack of empathy for the plight of the Irish poor, and part of that was based on blaming Irish people for their own immiseration, and it's also a way of, it's also not facing the reality that English colonial policy of the previous couple of centuries had created this issue, right? But part of it also is that it's just an invisible problem. It's not really present for you if you live in England. So in that context, Swift's text is making absurdly visible that which the discourse around Ireland had tried to omit, the suffering of Irish peasants, right? Which was sort of removed from the discussion. But it also uses that discourse, that highly rational, policy-driven discourse, to sort of render ironic just how silly the way people thought about Ireland really was and how inhuman and barbaric it was ultimately, he was in the longer term proved entirely correct, because as the 18th century wore on, poverty became more and more endemic, and gradually more and more famines started to occur in Ireland. It became a frequent issue, culminating in 1845 with the Great Famine, in which literally millions lost their lives. And this was, for Swift, not some accident of the poverty of Irish people or their stupidity or their naivety, but rather the result of the logic of English colonial thinking. And it's that which he's trying to confront. And that's why I think it's probably my favorite text on this course. Okay, so the last thing I just wanted to talk about was the video presentation. I've given you a few extra days to do it. I just wanted to briefly mention, because a few people had gotten in touch that they are worried about what does this consist of, right? What should the video do? And I just wanted to note that the delivery, like an English literature conference, is in some ways quite old-fashioned thing. And a lot of people have quite rightly pointed out that English conferences are a little bit outdated, right? So what you do at most English conferences is you sit up in a panel of 3 or 4 people, and each one speaks for about 12 to 15 minutes. And at the end, when they've all given their papers, they'll each talk for that number of minutes just about an aspect of the issue that of a topic. Say we were at a conference on 18th century satire. They'll each give a paper that narrows in on some aspect of their own research, and they'll present a very small argument about that to an audience where everybody in the audience is expected to have a certain amount of knowledge about this topic, but we're all looking to learn new things, and we're certainly interested in new ideas. And at the end of those 4 papers, you then the audience are allowed to ask questions, and those questions usually seek to challenge the ideas in the paper, or enable somebody to think about new ways they could bring their discussion, or suggest alternative texts to look at, or alternative perspectives, and it's about sort of challenging one another to be better. So that's what it's all about. That sort of idea that everybody sits silently while delivering a paper is quite outdated, I agree, but it is also how English literature, for now anyway, still does things. And that's why when you're doing a course like this, I still want you to do this video presentation, because it's an approximation of what we do as literary scholars. So it's part of your professional development, right? Is to learn, give that, and doing a video presentation and then having a kind of, let's say, a discussion forum kind of Q&A is just a nice way of, as closely as possible in an online course, approximating what happens in those literature courses. What I would say is, people are worried about the delivery style, like how should you deliver this? Fundamentally, because you're delivering a paper, you can just write a paper as you would a normal essay and read that paper. That's absolutely fine, and it's what a lot of people do, especially if you're not totally confident of the material, which a lot of us, we're all kind of new to 18th century satire here, so it's perfectly acceptable that you would be reading from a paper. What I would say though is, if you are reading directly from a script rather than ad-libbing a little bit, I would do a couple of things. First of all, try not to read directly from the page like that. It becomes really incommunicative if you're just reading straight to the paper. It becomes very monotonous. It's very hard for people to stay concentrating on it. So try not to do that too much. I would say practice the paper a few times before you record it, so that you're comfortable engaging with people and looking at the camera, because that's what we have to do instead of an audience, but looking at that, and then sort of you can consult your paper but be able to sort of engage. Another thing that I usually do is to keep the paper short, right? Nobody ever complained that a paper is too long, but I want you to stay under 12 minutes. But what I usually do is I stay well under that, to give myself a few minutes, so that, like, so for example, so if you have 12 minutes, that's probably maybe 1,500 words at most that you would write, but I would normally write maybe only 1,000 words, and too little is a lot better than too much. You don't want to go over. A chair could stop you talking at a conference if you go over. It can be quite an embarrassing thing, and it can be really awful. Cut things down. You can always expand on it in a Q&A, but you can't go over time at a conference. So feel free to reduce things down, first of all. I try and stay well under the time, and that way I'll have a little bit of time to sort of ad lib, or if I want to add a little comment or go off on a transition or something like that, I'll have that sort of space to do it. So I would keep this to about 1,000 words when you're preparing it. The second thing that I would do is to make sure that your writing is not too complex, that the sentence structures are fairly simple, that you're going to be able to read them without getting tongue-tied, but also that your audience is going to be able to follow it. They're not going to feel alienated, and try to keep the vocabulary relatively accessible. You don't want it to be too jargony, because if there's too much jargon, people will lose track. It's not like when they're reading a paper and they can look stuff up. They're just listening to you talk. So try and keep it simple, keep it engaging, keep it punchy. But the main thing to do is to remember that you're among friends here. It's been a really good course in terms of how encouraging you guys have been and how helpful you are to one another in discussion forums and in peer review. You're really, really good at working together. And remember that that's your audience here. Your audience here is not some intimidating group of scholars in the field of 18th century satire. It's the people you've been working with. It's the academic community that you've been establishing all semester, and those are still there, and they're there to support you. So try to relax about it. Don't worry if you stumble over a word or two. Don't start the video again if you make a little mistake. Be human about it. You're not being judged on your oratory anyway. It's just about communicating ideas, okay? The other thing is that keep in mind you're allowed to be trying out ideas. Conference papers are not always polished things. They can be unfinished business. They can be ideas. They can be suggestive. You should be advancing your ideas a little bit further than they were in your first short papers, those 1 or 2 page things. But you can still be working through ideas. It's absolutely fine. Then we'll move on to the questions. Good questions, like I say, are those that challenge the ideas in the paper, that challenge the speaker to reconsider their ideas rather than just reformulating what they've said or just telling somebody that they did a good job. If somebody has done a good job, tell them what you liked about it and how it helped you think something through, and ask them a follow-up question. Ask them to expand on it. But make sure that you're being graded on your Q&A stuff. We'll talk about that next week. You have time for that. But I want to make sure that that's a good experience, because conferences, as I say, the reason that they're valuable things to go to is not because you get to stand there and talk to people. It's because you get to find out, well, what sort of questions would people ask about my research? And that's why challenging questions that interrogate the ideas that somebody has and maybe find weak points in it or things that need to be improved are the most valuable questions you'll get, because those are the ones that help you think about, those are the things you should be thinking about anyway, right? Those are like the areas that you need to improve on. So it is an opportunity to become a better scholar. And the last thing that I would say before I go is that if you are interested in doing a real conference, if you are somebody who wants to pursue academic study of English a little bit further, or even a lot further, or make a career out of it, I'm all on board with anybody who wants to apply for conferences or anything like that. Come talk to me or send me an email and we can talk about what's involved in applying for a real conference, or I can put you in touch with somebody who is in the area that you're interested in if you wanted to give a paper at some time, because some of you will already be familiar with giving conference papers. I realize that some of you have probably done it before, but for some of you it'll be new. So the real last thing, after that last thing that I want to say, is to thank you again for all the contact I've had over the last while. The proposals look really good. It seems like you're all ready for this anyway, so it's not that I needed to give you very basic advice on what a video should look like. It's more like just to reassure you, you do know how, you have got this, you know how to do it, you'll do fine. But also to thank everybody who got in touch to ask me about that stuff, because it forced me to think, because I'm kind of inside literature conferences and stuff, and it's hard for me to get my head around. People don't necessarily know what a literature conference looks like, so that was cool to get those. But also to people who said, I need some extra time, I'm a little bit overwhelmed. I'm glad that you felt comfortable approaching me about that, because I want to make sure that the workload here remains manageable, and that you're always feeling on top of things. So it was great to hear from you guys. Yeah, and that still applies for the rest of the week. If you're having any issues with this, come talk to me and we can sort it out. Okay, thank you.